So, hello, welcome to another episode of BlabberMouths 101. I'm here with Dr. Harvey. Very excited to talk all about research. Where do we begin? Why do we need it as educators? And if I want to change my practices, what should I be looking at when it comes to research? So before we start, we always have our intro by Jorge Rodriguez. Here it goes.
You are a Ladies and gentlemen, I do not say blah, blah, blah.
All right. So, as we talked about, we are here with Dr. Harvey, fantastic doctor out of West Virginia University. Can you tell us, sir, a little bit about yourself before we start really getting into research and everything and anything we need to know from the very beginning?
Yes, sir. Given Andy Milne's not here, and Adam Lavore, I'll be the token British guy tonight. So I'm from England. I was born there, did school there. I went to Loughborough University to do my teaching license with Bunker and Thorpe, which is how I got into teaching games for understanding, and Len Armand. And then I went to the United States, and after doing my master's at Loughborough, after my teaching license, I taught in schools. Then I taught in an FE college, which is like a community college over here in the United States. And then I made my way to Oregon State University to do my doctoral degree with Hans van der Maas, who's a professor now at Arizona State University. That was in exercise science with the focus on physical education pedagogy. And I went back to England, worked there 7 years, had 2 children, worked also for field hockey in the governing body there in the England junior international teams, and then got a job back in the US because my wife wanted to come back home because she was homesick. So we brought our 2 children back here. I've also coached on over 50 soccer camps here in the United States over a period of like 8 summers. I have licenses in a number of sports and games, and I have an avid interest in games and games teaching. So that is a little bit about me.
Absolutely wonderful. Love the journey. And of course, wherever your wife wants to be, that is where you will end up. I know that for a fact. All right. So again, with the BlabberMouths 101, the concept is we start at the very beginning as if we are talking to college students or educators who may or may not have looked at research in 5, 10, 15, 20, X amount of years. So for us, before we even get started with looking at the actual research, actually looking at journals, why do physical education teachers, why do we need to look at research? Why do we need to know about research? I mean, isn't the body been the same for the last thousands of years?
It's a good question. I mean, I think for me, there's a big push in education for evidence-based practice. And so I think that starts with research that researchers and academics do at universities. And we are blessed that we have some teachers that agree to help us with our research studies, and that helps hopefully give some evidence around what teachers could potentially be doing in their programs if it's appropriate with the decision making at the local level. So that's probably the main thing. The challenges are, of course, is scaling the research in order that it's generalizable. If you want to look at it from a more, we call in research, a positivistic or behaviorist standpoint, when we're looking at evidence-based practice, we generally want quantitative data and numbers. This is useful when talking to school boards and that kind of thing. And the larger the data sets that we have makes the data much more generalizable. The issue with physical education as a field, and there is a number of issues, but one is that we don't attract the same grant funding as other areas of education like science, technology, math. And so it's very difficult to do scalable projects. So what you see a lot with the physical education research is very contextual, specific research with, quite low samples, but they're meaningful in terms of, the day-to-day workings of what happens in the classroom.
Nice. And like you said, the more we look into our teaching practice and the more we reflect on what's going on and we have objective eyes outside of the actual teacher, the better we're going to get at what we do, which is really where we need to be, especially like you said, the number of problems Phys Ed has faced in the past. All right. So now I think we've convinced people who may or may not have wanted to do some research. So now we start at the beginning. I'm ready. I have something in class I want to research. Where do I go? Where am I looking for, specifically in physical education? What is the resource or what website or where am I going that's going to get me to start finding this research that's out there?
Well, there's probably a number of platforms which are accessible by people who aren't doing master's degrees, who are not embedded within a university context in like I say, a master's or a PhD, or a pre-service teacher working through their undergraduate program. One thing I would say is getting connected on Twitter and trying to search out people, academics who are on Twitter as well in domains like, so you've got Dr. Hassan, who you've spoken to last week, you've got Dr. Casey, Vicky Goodyear, Dean Dudley, who was on Jorge's Voxcast, Shane Pill, myself. There are a number of people now on Twitter who have Twitter accounts and put out free access to certain articles that you've written. So that's a pretty good place. Second place is there is a website called researchgate.net. A lot of people think this is just a place for researchers to go and talk to other researchers. I mean, it is to some extent, but what I've encouraged my doctoral students to do, even if they don't have any publications, or if they've got some things they've written in JOPED. I know Colin Brooks had a paper in JOPED the other week, and I know Andy Vasily was the same. If you go into ResearchGate, you can create a profile, and this enables you to connect with scholars in fields. So if you have an interest in, say, cooperative learning, you could see if Ben Dyson, Ashley Casey, and that kind of thing, and they put access to their papers. Once they're out of their journal embargo, they put them on the ResearchGate website. So you can follow people even though you might not have publications, but it just keeps you up to date with what's going on. And in all honesty, I don't get access to all the journals either. So I actually go on research and get a lot of stuff from there.
Nice.
The other thing that people like myself do, and I know Vicky does, and Shane, we keep a blog. So you can find academics that do that kind of thing. And what we're trying to do with some of the blogs is translate some of the what would be seemingly long, complex papers that we write. I was speaking to I'm Sporticus the other day on Twitter, and I was saying, well, I try and write my papers so they're moderately understandable, because I know what it's like trying to read a paper, and if you get lost in the results, if they're not very well explained, you just put the thing down and you can't be bothered anymore. And the last thing we want to do is for that to happen. So I think there's a conscious effort on some of the people I've mentioned already to make sure that research is accessible and is translated so that it's useful for practitioners out in the field.
I know Ash does his what do you call it, podcast where he breaks down the research, which is kind of cool. I also know that it was funny when you were talking about how people write. I was just reading an article about literacy and power, and basically it's funny because people who are writing the journal articles are writing for other doctors and other researchers, which is interesting in that part, when really they should be writing for the layperson who doesn't know the jargon.
Definitely, and this is a huge problem that the field is facing. I mean, our aim is to have people be able to access this stuff. So accessibility is a problem. If you're outside a university and there's a journal embargo, when we publish an article now, particularly if it's with Taylor and Francis, you get 50 free e-prints. So you're able to post those e-prints on Twitter or on any other social media. Or what I've done with some of them is try to email those links directly to people that I know would be interested in first to download those articles for their personal resources. And then what I'll do is I'll post the remaining e-prints out on Twitter. So it's very useful to be connected with people like we are, and to be able to access people. The other thing that I would say is and Jorge would support this if he could actually get into the chat. If he's been able to do a great job of asking people to come on the Voxcast, things like I'm doing now. People are more than willing and ready to join in the conversation, because at the end of the day, what we're arguing is not like the only way of doing something. We're offering suggestions, and what we need is some feedback, but we want to get that feedback, so we need to make what we're doing translatable to the practitioners that we're working with. But the challenge is the academic journal wants us to theorize about our work, and sometimes you get lost in some of that theorizing, so it's not easy to translate what we're doing.
One of the other secret tips and tricks that I have about that is if you're in a school district and you have a high school that you're associated with, they have access to EBSCOhost.
Oh, really?
You use their logins, go in, you have access to all these journal articles.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very lucky. My mother-in-law is a media specialist at a high school. I have a high school that I work closely with, that I have access to these places. Most school districts are, K to 12. You could go into EBSCOhost and you could get all that. And I mean, you talked about before, because the price of buying a journal article can be anywhere from $30 to $120 for one article. It's crazy.
Yeah. So two things is the first is if you know of an author, you can the author, and sometimes the author will have those e-prints available, and they can send you a link to download one of those e-prints. So it's good to get to know people on a personal level. The second, not that you want to be chasing around all the time, but the other thing I would suggest that I've done is, if you go into Google and you have a Google account, you can go into Google and you can, and I've done this, you can set up Google Scholar alerts. You put in topics like teaching games for understanding, sport education, cooperative learning, and what you'll do is 3 times a week you will get an email to your inbox telling you what's being published in that area. Now, you might not be able to download the full article, but at least you will know that literature exists, and you'll be able to read the abstract. And again, the abstract's an overview of the journal article. And then even if you can't get access to it, then you can email the author and just see how it goes. And again, Taylor and Francis are very, very good. They've got one of our articles at the moment on questioning in games-based approaches to teaching and coaching, and it's free access. And they do this because it was seemingly one of the highly viewed articles of the year. And so what they've done is they've pushed that out as free access because it's in a particular issue, like in celebrating the fact that it was highly viewed by people. So they want to increase its access.
Nice. That is phenomenal. Just some great tips right there.
Hey, Dr.
So
Harvey,
now,
can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes,
All right.
we can, Jorge. Welcome. That's Jorge Rodriguez, folks.
No video, which is probably a good thing, but I do have audio. So I did want to ask a question. You mentioned, Dr. Harvey, you mentioned earlier writing your articles in kind of friendly language so that people can kind of understand what you're talking about and that kind of stuff. And I think with the technology that we have now, and you also mentioned, coming on podcasts and things like that, do you think that has had an impact in getting your information out? Not just publishing journal articles, but actually being able to come on podcasts and shows like this, like the Blabbermouth, to talk about some of the research that you've done.
Yeah, I mean, I just think you're a fool if you're, in the nicest possible way, why are we doing all this work and it's not being read by people? I mean, I go to all my articles and I could send you a list of them. I mean, I'm saying all my articles, there's not too many, but there's a few. If I go to them, they've got quite a high viewing count because I think they're on topics that have an interest with practitioners. And, you're working very closely with teachers and coaches and other practitioners. And there's this mutual understanding of what each other are getting out of the relationship. And then when you write those studies up, you try and write them up and try and describe the real life context in which the work was done. And I think that's very helpful to, a practitioner, because then what they can do is take that story or that narrative that comes through the paper and try and translate some of those, principles into their own teaching.
All right. So I believe now we know where to go. We know that, all right, make your social media connections. You have professors, you have people in the classroom, you have all kinds of people on social media, which we love. So now I find an article that I want. All right. What do I do from there? What should be the first thing that's going on once I find an article that hits the areas I need to hit?
Well, I mean, let's take the example that you've set up some of these Google Scholar alerts. And again, to be on Google Scholar, I mean, everyone's a scholar. Teachers are scholars, just in slightly different form. You're doing action-based research pretty much every day. So if you set up your Google Scholar alert, say something lands in your inbox and it's like this paper we're going to look at, it's gender and skill level differences in physical activity in a unit of basketball taught through the tactical games model, which is a derivative of teaching games for understanding. So if that hits, you go, oh, gender and skill level differences. So I teach co-ed PE. A lot of teachers in America do that. In England, it's a little bit different. Some are single sex physical education. What you want to do is that's of interest to me because I've started to integrate a tactical model into my teaching. And, now what I want to do is have a look at some of the research that will support or challenge some of the beliefs I have about what's going on in my classroom. So you access the abstract, which we're going to look at, and you will read the abstract, and you want to look through the abstract and see if the title is reflected in the abstract, which it should be, but sometimes you will find that it isn't, unfortunately. And then once you've read the abstract, you want to see whether that, like if I'm an elementary teacher, the paper might be about secondary school. So immediately I might be able to say, well, this is of some interest to me because it's about tactical games, but I'm going to leave that to the side because I'm not teaching in a middle school right now. I'm teaching elementary. This paper that we're going to look at was written from data collected with 4th and 5th graders and from 7th graders, and did pretty much the same content with some, developmentally appropriate modifications. So with reading the abstract, you'll be able to pick out, simple things like that. And also you can kind of get a flavor of, is it a study that's trying to compare two approaches like tactical games and a more direct instruction? Or is it a paper that like this, it's an observational kind of study? Is it a pre-post design, which means we collect data at the start, before an intervention, and then after an intervention? And then you can sort of determine, the value that might have for your context. The other thing that you'll be able to find out is whether it's quantitative data, which means it's about numbers, or whether it's a qualitative study where they've used things like some longer answer survey questions, or it uses some interview techniques, or something like that.
Very cool. So we're looking for, make sure that the journal article or the research is appropriate for what we're teaching. If it's not too far above or below our level, I have that. Am I looking at the size, the sample size yet, or is that not fall into effect yet?
Yeah, I'll just answer this, and then I think Jorge wanted to say something. Yeah, the sample size would be something to consider, because I don't think that would preclude you from reading an article if it's with one class and one teacher. That's different. Like this one was with two teachers, obviously one in the elementary, one in the, but with multiple class periods. So it's a little bit different, but I think that will affect not you reading it, but it will affect your judgment of the article at the end. But sometimes we're not always about generalizability, because generalizability comes from large samples across multiple schools in multiple school districts, for example. Whereas, like I alluded to earlier, a lot of the research that we do, because of funding, is limited to smaller samples, which unfortunately then become less generalizable. But what we have is a concept called transferability, because if the paper is written in such a way is a teacher can read it and make the judgment about the value of the research for the case they've done, and say, well, some of this happens to me in my context, so I'm concerned about girls not being as active as boys in my context, like this paper is going to talk about. So I'll read this paper and it will describe some of the issues that happened during the study. And therefore you might say, oh, well, when I'm teaching, I need to try and balance out the activity levels, and here's some suggestions on how I can do it. So I'm going to try them out.
All right.
Yeah, so I just had a quick question, and you answered it a little bit, but I was just kind of wondering, could you talk a little bit about the process of getting some of your research published, and kind of like the peer review process and how that works?
Yeah, even before then, the one thing that Justin and I talked about as we came in to the chat before people joined us live was, you've got ethics. So what I have to do, like with this study we're going to talk about, I had to put in an ethics application to the university. We have a platform which isn't, and at the time it wasn't very user friendly. That ethics application has to talk about, risk to do the study. We used accelerometers. That means I had to take height and weight of the children, and that's considered health information. I have to fill out a consent form. I had to get the children to take that home and have that signed by parents. And then I had to assent the children as well before the study. The other thing was that this study then was what we call expedited, which means it goes for peer review from ethical standpoint, and then it comes back to me. So I had a to and fro even at the university level trying to get ethical approval for the study. So once that took about 3-4 weeks, and then you've got to recruit teachers who are willing to work with you, and then you've obviously got, like I said, to go into the school and start talking to the children. It's very difficult when they don't know you from Adam, as we say. We're missing Adam tonight, aren't we? They don't know you to have you in their classroom and say, hey, will you help me with a research project? And it's very difficult for children to make an informed decision, but I've got to not be coercive to the children and be, if they don't want to participate and wear an accelerometer around their waist, I can't tell them that they have to, or they're going to get a bad grade, and I have to write about that in my ethics. So that's the first part. Then obviously we go in and collect the data. With this study, there were, I can't remember, about 60 lessons in this study, around about. So I sat through every single one of them 60 lessons, and set up the accelerometers with a research assistant before, because you've got to program them beforehand and get them ready. We only had enough for 4 of the groups at the middle school because they were following on from each other. So for 3 of the groups. So we then had to reprogram some of the accelerometers during the lesson periods that were going on, that I was observing. Someone had to take the accelerometers and reprogram them. So it's a challenge. And then I was systematically coding the teacher behavior that's not reported in the study. And I was also watching the lesson context. So how much time the teacher was spending in gameplay versus skill practice versus management time and knowledge time. So that's a very laborious process, to watch 60 lessons and to be concentrated for that. And we have to have training for people like me, observers, to be able to go in and be able to do that type of thing. And then you have to get reliability, and we're going to talk about reliability. So that's the data collection. And then only when you've got the data and things go wrong, one day the accelerometers didn't work. So that's what happens. We had assemblies, we had snow days, we had school delays as we were collecting all this data. And we, the school where they had delays would change the schedule. So instead of having PE in the morning, they'd have it in the afternoon. So as a research team, we had to be ready to shift our schedule. And I had teaching at the university. And I was on the promotion and tenure committee, so I had meetings for that. So we're juggling everything to try and get these data collected. And things, like I say, go wrong. Children don't turn up. Children stop halfway through the lesson and decide they don't want to participate anymore because they've got injured. Some of them get called out to go see the principal or their classroom teacher. So all this affects the data, because then you've got to clean the data when you get it. So once we had the data from the accelerometers, we had to plug those into the computer, download all the data, and then use a software that we got with the accelerometers to program the cut points that we use to get moderate to vigorous physical activity. And only when we then have all the data and that gets put out into Excel, we then had to put that in a statistics package. We then had to run our tests of difference for girls and boys and school level, etc. And then, well, we didn't do the school level tests in the end. We got told by the reviewer to take those out. So we, but once we got our data, we have to run the tests. And then you should know the literature in this area, because what you've got to do is position your research study within the body of literature that already exists. So within this abstract, you will see, we're arguing the case that the 50% MVPA ratio came from somewhere. It came from Healthy People 2010. We don't know how it ever got agreed, but it came up in that policy document. And I've written, depending on the physical activity instrument you use, you may or may not get 50% MVPA. And we did not get 50% MVPA in the study, albeit that children spent most of their time in gameplay. So what we've started to do is look at MVPA and start to separate it out to moderate and vigorous physical activity. But when you look at even vigorous physical activity, when you add it up over the course of a physical education week, it's pretty negligible, the contribution it's making, because, if elementary children are only having physical education once a week, that's a little bit of a problem. But what we're trying to do is position this research with making the case that vigorous physical activity counts and should be documented alongside the moderate to vigorous physical activity. So it should be separated out, because we haven't really started to have that conversation in research yet. So we started to position it there. Also, the gender differences is interesting, because there was a study done with gameplay behavior of boys and girls within physical education, where Gutierrez and colleagues found that girls were doing more off the ball movement, but didn't have the ball as much and wouldn't get past it as much. They played in mixed co-ed games than boys, who tended to dominate possession. And then there's obviously an implication for physical activity in that regard. So the findings of this study were positioned in that regard, because these obviously add some data to those findings, in terms of now we're finding out that girls don't possess the ball as much. they move off the ball, but they don't get as much physical activity either as a consequence. So it's a problem if we're in these co-ed contexts, and particularly in the United States, children work in those co-ed contexts. So that's all the positioning of the study, and then you send it into a journal, and this is going to be published in a special issue, rules-based practice, or curriculum instruction. So we found it out because the Journal of Teaching and Physical Education were having this special issue. So in December, I had to submit an abstract to be considered, then to get the paper invited for submission. I then had to this was December 2015, so we finished collecting data in April 2015. So then we wrote the paper the full paper between December and April, submitted that for review. We got that back on the 21st of June or something by the journal with a bunch of comments, and you see the red that's on this document. This is the changes we had to make because the review was requested. So we got it back something like the 20th of June. I resubmitted it on the 28th of June because I'm just like that. I'm very keen. We then got the paper back on August the 19th, accepted for publication. And I'm a little bit more experienced in writing, so I believe that helps with this process, because the first draft you submit to the journal is sometimes a little bit more polished. But you can get these back from journals where you have them rejected, an outright rejection. You get major revisions, you then get minor revisions, and then you get acceptance. So it's very rarely something gets accepted with no revisions, and it's very rarely you even get a minor revision on a first review. So this had a major revision, and major revisions tend to be different depending on the nature of the data you've collected. It could be some methodological questions you get. It could be them wanting more information about the process that you went through in training teachers, yada yada yada. So it's so we finished collecting the data, and then this paper will come out in the special issue in October this year. So it's from starting data collection. We started in fall 2014. The paper will come out in pretty much the fall 2016. So a 2-year process.
Wow, that's really long. And I had no idea that the red were all revisions you had to do. That's pretty cool. Now I learned something new right there. So once we looked at the abstract and we go, okay, we look at sample size, we look at age, we look at, does it have the study, the title of the study in it? Now I go, okay, this is something I want to look into more. So now we should go to the introduction. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, when you read journal articles, what we talk to with our doctoral students is there was a paper, I can maybe put the link in, how to read a research paper, and what they suggest sometimes is that you do a first pass of the paper. And we sort of teach our doctoral students to do this in about 15 minutes. So what you would do is you would you'd read the abstract. You should read the first couple of lines in each of the paragraphs as you go through the paper, and then you should be able to get in and read the conclusions in a lot of depth. So what you don't do is like spend a lot of time getting embroiled too much in the detail. You just sort of read it and have a think and consider the paper. And then what you can do is go back a second time if you feel that it fits within your little area and your niche that you want. You can go back to it and give it a second read. So I'm just trying to bring up this bring up this paper. Now, when you read for a second time, what you should start to do is get into the detail. And what you want to do is inspect the figures in the tables. You want to look at the statistical analyses that were done and read in detail the methodology and that kind of thing, and look at the results and make sure that the results align with the research question that was asked and that kind of thing. But I wouldn't worry too much about that on the first pass. But you want to get into that more critical look and view of it as you get into the second read. There's a couple of questions. You want me to deal with the quick questions?
Sure, absolutely.
So Kari and Joe have asked about, is there a time when research isn't relevant? Academia runs very slow. I saw someone online was reading a book called, I can't remember, but it had in the title Slow. It was Slow Academics or something like that, and it had a snail on the front. Academia works very slow. And as long as you are there and thereabouts, your research is still pretty current. I mean, the whole models, curriculum models, standards-based instruction, there's, this sort of wheel is turning at the moment. So we're well positioned. Jorge said about technology. So the thing we're doing at the moment with Twitter, it's funny, I was just in ESPE chat and somebody else from education's doing a similar survey, but for education. So you might get beaten to the punch. That's probably more likely, where you're doing some research and someone else is doing it at the same time, and they make the same finding as you, but they publish their work earlier than yours. So that's an issue. But journals have become really good at giving strict deadlines now to reviewers. So if you submit a paper to a journal, they'll put on their website that it's a 45-day for a first review. So that's Journal of Teaching and Physical Education, which is a premier journal in the United States, they would have a 45-day turnaround for a reviewer. And then they'll give you 45 days to address those comments and submit it back. And if you don't do it, you miss out in the queue or in the line. You go to the bottom of the pile, or they might not even accept it back, and you'll have to send it to another journal. So if you can get something through within like one revision, that's 90 days. So that's 3 months from first submission. So that's pretty. Another 45 days to review. So that's like 4.5 months. And then now journals are quite quick at sending, because what happens after it's accepted is you have to, Taylor and Francis or Human Kinetics will send you a proof where it sort of formats it to the needs of the journal and the page limits and stuff, and they send it to you for one final check. And then you make any edits. It's usually just to like little words here and there where you've made a little typo. And then you send it. Usually if a journal's good, they take care of all that ahead of time. So it's just reading through the paper and giving a thumbs up and sending it back. And then it goes into production for final production. And then it comes out online ahead of print. And Taylor and Francis, who publish like Joped and Strategies, they're very, very good at that. And they put the article out online ahead of print so that it's accessible. And then they give an issue number later. So that helps stop things from getting, that are not current. But if you understand the process, you know that when you read a paper, it was probably something that was read about a year ago, finished about a year ago, or the data was collected about a year ago, because you can't turn things around that quick.
All right, so we went through the first read super quick. We looked at the abstract. We go, okay, just hit the major things I need to. Now the second read we're going through, we're spending a little more time breaking it down. And I did read those things after we had talked. of how do you read a research paper, and they said the third time is when you really start to understand what is going on, which is a little more interesting. So when am I really looking at the bulk of the research article, looking at it and saying, all right, what is the information? How am I critical of what's going on? Is that the second read or the third read?
I think it starts in the second read when you start to identify, where there's missing information, or you'd like to. I mean, that should get taken care of in the review process. But I mean, I like to give quite a rich description of the context where I'm working and what the type of school it is that we were working in, and then when we do an intervention, like although this was an observational study, we still had to train the teachers to use TGFU, and there was still some like monitoring and feedback to the teachers. And so what we were doing was trying to document that process within the method. So one thing you could look at is, does this researcher really document what went on, or do they miss parts of the story out? Because that's not entirely helpful to a teacher.
Now, where is that in the article? When I'm looking at the article, what sections would I be looking at to see? Are they leaving anything out? Is it skewed to their point of view? Where am I going to see that?
I mean, there's a thing called confirmation bias, where people like myself do research in tactical games, and so Joe Bailey will love this. We think it's the best thing since sliced bread, right? So we decide that that's an English saying. So we we like to have confirmation of our hypothesis. So our purpose statement of the paper might be, we want to examine if there are gender differences between boys and girls. And like you said in one of your things to me, is when do we accept and reject the null hypothesis? So the null hypothesis is that there's not going to be a difference, and then if there's not a difference, we reject it. But generally researchers are hoping when they set up a study, that they meet their hypothesis, because that's why they did the darn thing in the first place, right? But you've got to be careful that you don't do anything, particularly if you're running an experiment like comparing two approaches to teaching, that you support both teachers equally. And we see a lot of research in TGFU, and I've done some of this where where you support the TGFU teacher more than you do the direct instruction teacher, because they know direct instruction, so we'll just let them get on with it. So that's a flaw that a good reader of the paper will pick up, that, well, you stood on the floor and helped this teacher teach with TGFU, and then you give them loads of feedback, but you didn't do that with the direct instruction teacher. And then you found that the TGFU teacher, the kids they taught did better on this game performance test than the other kids, right? Well, duh.
Sense.
That's confirmation bias. So we've got to be very careful when we design studies to make sure that confirmation bias doesn't exist, and the experimental design we use tries to eradicate some of that confirmation bias.
And that's in the stats, correct? Won't that come up, or is that going to come up in your reflection, or are you going to brush over that because you barely realize you're doing it? Where would that show up?
And also in the review process, would that show up in the review process, the confirmation bias?
Yeah, I mean, what should happen is you should address that as a limitation of the study at the end and say, look, clearly when we went into this, we should have probably done this a little bit better. And our reflection is, like Justin said, that we should have done this better. What we need to do next time is have maybe a group of teachers that don't get any support, a group of teachers who do direct instruction, do what they're normally doing, like teach basketball however they want. We have a group that do direct instruction and get feedback, and we have a group that do TGFU and get feedback, right? So then we'll be able to see whether there's a difference between TGFU and feedback, and direct instruction and feedback compared to like a placebo group, right? Someone who just doesn't get anything. Because then we can tease out, well, what is it about TGFU or tactical game that's making the difference over and above the direct instruction, given we've given the same feedback to those two teachers? And if we give support to both sets of teachers, does that support help them more than another group of teachers who don't get any feedback, right? So when you read studies, particularly when they're experimental designs, you need to think about these things when you look at the paper, and that's in the design. And the research question for that design would be, do the kids who have tactical games play a better game as measured by X than the kids who don't get TGFU and get direct instruction? So the research design should really be done to answer that question, and like you say, not done with any bias in mind, to make sure you just reject the hypothesis when it likely could be true, and it's a design flaw. So you acknowledge that in your limitations of the paper, and then you take it from there. Now, what I did in this study is I avoided that because I did an observational study. So what an observational study was, I trained or worked with two teachers. Train's a bad word. I worked with two teachers and I gave them both feedback, but we didn't compare TGFU against something else or tactical games against something else. We just looked at the differences between the boys, the physical activity of the boys and girls. And we didn't do anything. The teachers were instructed to put the kids in teams. They didn't know that we were going to look at gender differences. And because they were classes, they were given the prompt to put them in mixed ability teams, right? Whatever that means. But they decided on the teams because they knew the kids. We didn't draw the teams out of the hat. That could have been something we did do. So that's something else you could look into. Now, the problem with this research design is that when this paper goes out, people are going to critique this because they're going to say, well, how do you know that kids even get more physical activity with tactical games than they do with direct instruction? But the answer to that is, well, that's not what we were trying to find out. We were looking at the gender differences, and we were looking at the reporting of the physical activity across the two schools, the elementary and the middle school.
Nice. All right. So we just looked at the research design, which is cool. When am I looking at the method? Can we talk a little bit about the method over here? And I will share that with everybody out there. When am I going to look at the article and say, hey, this matters?
I'll just answer this question that Joe had first, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Joe said at one point, would you say research is out of date? And she said an instructor that she had told her, or a professor had said that if you use papers that are older than 10 years, then they're out of date. Well, in some senses, that's true. But in other senses, if you don't go back to papers that were written 10 years ago, you don't have the historical thread of how that research has developed over a period of time. And therefore, when you look at the introduction of a paper, you don't know where that paper's positioned with respect to other papers. Like I said before, this paper's positioned in this sort of like narrative that kids should be getting 50% MVPA, and largely we know that kids don't, whether it's tactical games or not. But this was specifically looking at tactical games because some previous studies we've done and some other studies that people have done has suggested that 50% MVPA is actually attainable because of the nature of tactical games being quite game-based. And that's when kids get higher physical activity, particularly in invasion games, which we all know that's when kids get most physical activity in invasion games or fitness type activities. So you have the abstract, the introduction, which positions the paper and provides an argument and finishes with the purpose of the study. Then you move into the method. The research design is part of the method, and the method also includes the description of who the participants are. So in this study, there were 174 students, and there was 79 girls in total. 78 students were at the middle and 96 at the elementary, and it tells you how many of those 78 and 96 were girls. From fourth, 7th, and 4th stroke 5th grade co-ed classes at 2 schools. So the elementary was one school and the middle school was the other. So as Justin said, you can make a determination from this whether. So one of the comments we got from the reviewers was you can't generalize findings from this study because your sample size is too small. Because we argued that one of the strengths of this study was the sample size. Usually in some previous research, we found that other researchers would get 2 classes, one of 25 kids and another one of 27 kids, and then use those data. So we use multiple classes, so our sample size is a lot greater. But the fact it was restricted to 2 schools in the same school district is still a limitation, and still needs to be something that needs to be addressed in in further research. And to give you a bit of backdrop, I got $25,000 from my university, an internal grant to do this study. And I spent most of the money. So that's how much it took. But this is only one part of the data. I got a little bit more data, some survey data on motivation, which we're working on at the moment to try and publish, and some teacher behavior data. But to sit and watch 60 lessons or thereabouts is very time consuming. And particularly when, for reliability purposes, you need 2 people there to sit and watch what's going on in the classroom and to give judgment when they're coding tallies of how many times somebody does something over the course of that lesson. It's very labor intensive, and therefore you have to pay people to do it, and that's why you need grant money. And if subsequently, if I can't go to the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health and get a grant, another grant, to help me, I can't do another study like this, or a study that's more broader, working across, with teachers from various different school districts. Oh, and by the way, when you approach school districts, that's another headache, because you've got to get permission from the county school board, then you've got to get permission from the principal, and then you've got to obviously get the agreement of the teacher. So if the school board say no, then it's a done deal. So sometimes there's tension because some school boards are sold on a particular curriculum or instructional model. So that means that you can't do research in their school district because they only work with one particular version of physical education. So that's a challenge. So
can you talk about the observer reliability right here? You said there's 2 people there. How did you make sure you and the other person were seeing the same things? Did you ever both observe the same class at the same time and do the same thing and compare your numbers?
Yeah, so with lesson context can be management, knowledge, gameplay or skill play, or fitness or other. But like other might be just free play, like roll out the ball, right? So what we will do is we'll sit there every 20 seconds. We get every 10 seconds we get a prompt, either record or observe. So we observe for 10 seconds and record what happened in that last 10 seconds at the record prompt. So if you got a 30-minute lesson, you'll get 3 records every minute. And so over the course of 30 minutes, you get how many ever. I should be good at stats, but my brain is not 10:30.
Yeah,
what we do,
90.
We use the lesson context descriptions from Tom McKenzie's system for observing fitness instruction time. Tom has some pre-prepared training videos that are on. I'm doing jumping jacks because he said brain boost time.
Yeah, you're right about that.
So we took Tom's videos, and 2 of us watched the videos and made sure from those videos that we were getting the answers right that Tom puts on the video. Once we agreed on the videos, then we went out to some lessons before we even collected the data and checked that we got those reliabilities ahead of time, and then we went out and we knew we were ready to do the reliability for the study. So that's all done ahead of time before we even walk into the school to start the study proper.
Yeah, that makes sense over there. All right, so let's talk about the results. Now we finally get to the section. This is where I think most people struggle because isn't this very stat driven? And I know I took stat classes 10 years ago. I don't really understand it anymore. I don't think I understood it when I took it. The day I finished, I forgot everything new there. So what am I looking for in the results section here?
Well, the first part of these results is reporting model benchmarks. So this is this debate and discussion about the fidelity of the teacher to the model. So when we looked at model benchmarks, we decided there was 4 benchmarks for the teacher. Like, did they spend most time in gameplay? Did they ask deductive questions? Did they use high rates and guides of feedback? And then there was one other one. And then for the students, did they spend their time making situated tactical decisions? Were they given the opportunity to answer deductive questions? And then there was a couple more. So what we did is 2 of us observed lessons for a portion of these. And then for that, observe reliability. And then we took the, we took the results of the lead observer and then noted down whether the teacher was not doing those benchmarks, was okay on those, like they did it sometime. Like, so for example, if I asked the students a question, but then cut them off, that would be a no. If I asked them a question, but waited like a couple of seconds and they gave me an answer and I said, well done, and then just moved on, that might be okay. But if I asked a question and started to stimulate some type of discussion, then the teacher would be using that questioning very well. So that's how we made these determinations. So
Dr. Harvey,
yeah.
did the teachers have training in TGFU beforehand? I mean, were they familiar with the process?
Yeah, we went through the process in a couple of meetings. I provided them with the materials from the Mitchell, Oslin, and Griffin book. And then I went and looked at them using a couple of, the elementary teachers set up before the kids broke for Christmas, he set up the gym and the teams he was going to use, and then he knew how to set up the small-sided games, and then it was just a matter of him understanding and going through the drills with me, or the skill drills in the middle of the lesson. And what we did is we met the morning of the session and just went through how we would set up the drill, the skill drill, and then the modifications. With the teacher at the middle school, what we were able to do was like a same thing. So the day we finished teaching, say lesson 1, we then sat down and went through lesson 2, and we would be on the floor, and even if he had a couple of kids around for his 6 lesson class, we would set up the little drill bit with the kids. So he knew they weren't like experts by any stretch of the imagination. And the good thing about the observational design was I was not really limited to giving them feedback, because I could describe that in my method about how much feedback I gave them and why, but I wasn't distorting my results. Do you see what I mean? Because I wasn't comparing this against another model where I was giving these teachers more feedback than somebody else. So that's kind of how that process worked. It's a good question. So with the results, those were just the benchmarks. So what those results told you was that the teachers had quite high fidelity to the model. So what that tells you is the results are quite believable, that the teacher actually did TGFU or tactical games. And because I was observing, and one would say that I've got some experience in observing teachers using a tactical model, and I had reliability for those benchmarks.
Nice. All right, so let's finish up with the last part of this bad boy. So let me see if we can go. And that would be the discussion. So what am I looking at when I am reading the discussion? And for me, the discussion always makes me angry because it never tells me a definitive anything. It just says in the future we should do more of this, or in the future go look at this. It's more questions, which always is like, no, that's why I read this so I could get the answer. But anyway, tell me, what am I looking for in the discussion section?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you would be looking at is whether, there are some. So, like in this study, for example, kids did not meet the 50% MVPA. The results showed that girls got significantly less physical activity than boys in both the elementary and the middle school. So those things are reiterated. So so that's the results. So let me go back a step. So what I got told was what you should really do is first talk about your results. Then you need to talk about your results in relation to other studies that have been done in this area and whether they're the same or different. And then the third thing you need to do is give some practical implications for teachers. So based on these results in the discussion, these might be some strategies that teachers should employ based on these results. So clearly, there needs to be something done to, the mixed ability thing and just randomly assign them doesn't work. And in this paper, it's difficult for us to say what does work because we didn't do another way of organizing the kids. But there was a previous study done where they did do that. And they found that girls, by separating girls and boys out of each other, didn't help either, right? So, our sort of conclusion here was that, well, maybe something like letting the kids play where they want to play. So some girls will play with the boys and some girls will play with the other girls. Now, the issue here and the challenge for us as physical educators is that going to mean that it's okay on some courts that it's going to go up, but on these other courts, there's going to be still a real issue. And what are we going to do about that? So there's still some burning questions there, but at least we can make some suggestions. We know that just putting kids in, like from this study, they're not generalizable, but we have some insights into in basketball playing 3v3. It didn't work just having mixed ability teams, right? Because I was watching the boys, one of them gets at the, so it's, if you are going to have mixed teams, take turns. Who carries the ball out from the top of the circle? Because we played 3-on-3 to one basket, and that suppressed physical activity because there wasn't a transition.
Correct.
But if you look at a basketball game, you're not 50% probably active in a basketball game. I looked at some of the literature, and you spend a lot of the time, more than 50% of your time in a basketball game sedentary, because you do a sprint, then you get in position, and then you're shuffling and defending, and then there's the big transition, and that's when so we found some results that would be not surprising in the sense of they've mirrored the game of basketball. So those are the three things. What did this study find that's new? What's news, right? What are the results in comparison to, in the discussion into other research that's been done to position your paper? And then what are some of the practical implications for teachers based on these results?
Nice. You need to come to my men's league basketball on Wednesday night and tell the moles who don't pass the ball, nobody wants to watch you play basketball when you're on their team. That's just it. Pass the ball, people.
And these are great. So the take home, the conclusion, if we put it up, was we need to come up with ways to make the games fun, energetic, and get everyone involved to make sure that. And what you just said there was a way to do it. So we had a rule: you have to have 3 passes before you shoot, and you can't have games that become.
But then your studs still do the same thing. Then your 2 people pass it back and forth 3 times while the one person still watches.
Yeah, you need to implement TGFU in your rec league game there.
Yeah, that's what I need to do. Absolutely.
But
Absolutely. But no, I agree. Going back to, and that's why I started, cheering a little bit to myself, because that's the only thing that makes sense, is saying, hey, if you think you're a beginner, go to the beginner court, and all the beginners get together. They'll kind of fumble their way through it, and everybody will be comfortable. The middle goes to the middle, the top goes to the top. I know that in certain cases we want to mix it up, but for me, it's just like you said, comfort level. Everybody gets a chance. If not, you watch your stud go through, whether it's male or female, get the ball the whole time. They keep it. They scored a touchdown. They scored a basket. They scored a goal, whatever it is. And everyone else is watching, even when you're doing small-sided.
Well, and the other thing in this study, finding about the results really, was like the lesson context. I mean, the teacher spent, I can't remember what was it, about 45% of the lesson in gameplay. But they also spent about 30% of the lesson, 27 in knowledge. And this is a problem, because we've got this, and this is a debate that was going on the PE chats yesterday. This notion of being physically active, but having that cognitive engagement and that learning, and getting those effective and cognitive, juices flowing, so to speak. And if you just go for physical activity, well, we could all give kids 15 laps, but that's not very motivating, and they're not learning anything, that's going to be fulfilling for later life, even if you do get left out in the men's basketball game, but we won't talk about it. But what I'm saying is, teachers were bringing the students in. One thing we did suggest is what the teacher did was stop the whole class and bring them around to one demo. What I've been doing with my student teachers is setting up a demo ahead of time, just with one group, so all the other kids keep playing their game. And Phil Ward's talked about this, the show and go. One of his teachers calls it a 30-second show and go. Get everyone in real quick, like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right, this is what we're doing. Here's the practice. Go, right? Get back out. So that show and go, and having a stopwatch that you start when you say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then get them back out. And if you've just spent 2 minutes, right, doing that, my accelerometer readings is reading 0. So what we talked about in a previous paper was having a 70-20-10 rule. So you need to have 70% of your time, which is focused on students engaging in content. And what I mean by that is, you could still be questioning and working with one group, but the other 2 groups are going. So you have to limit like whole group instruction, basically, and times when you stop the whole group. So you've really got to figure out, when you go to stop the whole group, why are you going to do it? What's the compelling reason you need to stop everyone? And if you have to stop everyone, keep the stoppage to 30 seconds.
So, yeah, that would probably be a safety issue is the only thing that pops in my head.
Yeah. So Dr. Hart, go ahead. Yeah. I'm sorry.
No, you go. So that was lesson context. So that was another sort of big finding. We tend to find that coaches and teachers spend a lot of time not engaging their kids in the content and talking.
I was just going to say, that that I've been kind of doing that with my classes, where taking a small group and kind of demonstrating and talking about tactical analysis of, we're doing target games now, and I found that some groups kind of get it really well right off the bat, and other groups kind of tend to need a little bit more instruction or need a little bit more time to kind of get the grasp of those basic concepts. So that those ratios of times, I think it's a good rule of thumb, but also it could be adjusted based on the group, correct?
Yeah, for sure. And, the stage they are in a unit or the stage of the year. I mean, I think that Hans van der Mars talks about is, we know that we get most MVP in invasion games and fitness, right? In target games, there's no way we're going to get 50%. But does it mean it shouldn't be in the curriculum? Of course it doesn't. It's like, again, in dance, there are going to be some lessons in dance where they're more creative. They're, might be using cooperative learning and they're creating a dance. They're taking on different roles. The chances of getting it 50% of it, but that's not our only goal. Our suggestion with our literature in TGFU is that we can do our best to get most of those outcomes concurrently. You know, we can get a physical activity outcome, a cognitive outcome, and an affective outcome because it's more holistic, right, of an approach. I think a lot of these second generation models like cooperative learning and that are the same. You know, we're getting at those multiple outcomes. But there are going to be, so over the course of your year, as long as you plan to have some units that have higher physical activity, right, and then some that have lower physical activity, and you balance those out across the school year, then, you know, I mean, it's common sense, isn't it? But, you know, that's what we're going to have to, you know, be talking about, you know, in relation to this sort of small study. That might be another take-home point.
All right. Well, listen, Dr. Harvey, thank you very, very much for spending the time with us. I know research is something that is necessary for us. If we are not looking at research, then we are not growing. And I have my gut feeling about certain things, but just because I have a gut feeling doesn't make it truth until we have some evidence to really back us up, or somebody out there saying, hey, this is what you should be doing because of blah, 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 and then showing us the facts and figures behind it. Then it's really just us, you know, guessing, which isn't, you know, the best way to do things, especially when we talk about teaching and shaping children's lives. So before we go, the last thing I would like you to do, please tell us about this Twitter study that is going on, and I will tweet it out again for the third time. What is going on with this? What do you want from us out there in the world?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a really good response. In a previous study with educators more broadly, they got about a sample of 750. I was hoping to get somewhere around the 250 mark. I think I'm around 150 participants at the moment. So I'm just trying to drum up any extra numbers. You know, so I know I'm probably being a little bit overbearing, but I'm you know, I'm just trying to make sure that I get the voice of the people that are out there and a representative sample, in order that when we write the study up, we can report what is actually going on out there. So what it requires is that people participate in a 5 to 10 minute survey. There's about 7 or 8 short tick box questions, and then about your demographics, 5 questions that say like how long have you been teaching and that kind of thing, and then some questions about which hashtags you use, and you just click the ones, and then there's a couple of questions at the end saying what do you like about using Twitter, and has it impacted your students' learning. So
All right.
if you tweet it out,
I was just saying, what are we going to do with this study?
well, I would, you know, I think some of the people who were on Twitter and whatever, what I'm finding is that the response is very positive from people. There's some very positive things, like people say it's a way of networking, having a professional learning community. It's informal. You get quick responses to questions you have that fix, you know, problems immediately that you're having in your classroom. Someone put it on Adam Laveau's video. You know, you post something and you get an answer in the US, and you get an answer from Saudi Arabia within 5 minutes. So it's pretty cool. So what we're trying to do is document these things, look and see if they're the same as what teachers in education more broadly are saying about Twitter. And then what we can do is look and see, well, a couple of things, like how do these things you learn on Twitter translate into your daily practice in a subsequent study? And what can we do to increase the amount of teachers that are on Twitter, and also increase the quality of the information that's on Twitter? Because as we know, it's a bit like going to TJ Maxx. You have to go through all the genes that aren't very good before you find the pair of 7s for all mankind that you were looking for. Because there's a lot of stuff on the shelf that, you know, it's there because nobody wanted it. So well done, Kari. I like TJ Maxx as well. We call it TJ Maxx in England. So you know, it's just useful. Like I say, more people participate. I'm giving a more generalizable view of what's going on in the field. Although we do know that not as many teachers, or quite a low number of teachers, are actually on Twitter. I haven't got the exact percent, but I don't, 5 to 7% of teachers actually have a Twitter account. So, what we want to do is look at the benefits that we have for it, and also, make sure that, we can tell organizations like New Jersey, AFID, Shape America, what the benefits are, and really push it out there. And, with the caveat that it's not the be all and end all, and it's not perfect. And if you're on Twitter, like we're doing tonight, if you see a research study, be a critical consumer of the information. Hopefully then the Chinese whisper phenomenon doesn't occur, that you get one message, but by the end, like in games-based approaches, don't use drills. Well, where did that come from? But if that's a message that goes out on Twitter and it gets tweeted, by the end, we get this message of, well, in games-based approaches, we don't use drills. Well, that's wrong. We use game-related practices and skill drills when appropriate as needed for the students, right? So we've got to make sure that we're not getting these, pseudo-scientific beliefs being shared, and that we get shared, the evidence-based practice, which, to a large extent is what we get. But there is obviously, we need to be critical consumers of the information that is out there on Twitter.
All right. Well, thank you very much, sir. We appreciate it. And have a good night, Jorge. Appreciate you coming on air, sir.
Yep.
Have a good one, everyone.
Right, thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate you being here.
Peace.